Hello guys, this is an overview of how to replace the 2.5 liter Skyactiv engine in your Mazda CX-5. So here we have a used engine from a junkyard. It was in an accident, so the intake manifold is cracked, so we'll be swapping that over later. Here's the old engine in the vehicle. This engine was leaking oil from the head, and Mazda said they didn't want to warranty it because they warranty coolant leaks from the head. So I started by removing the battery, the air box, the fuse box, the computer, a bunch of grounds, anything that was in the way on the top of the transmission, some evap lines on top of the engine. I started removing some cooling hoses, that's why there's a bit of a mess on the transmission. So in order to remove the front axles and the subframe, I undid the lower control arms from the subframe. I did not mess with the ball joint end because they were rusty. Undid the steering column pinch bolt and lowered the subframe down with the transmission jack. I left the AC compressor in the vehicle, unbolted the drive shaft to the rear wheels and the exhaust. The steering column pinch bolt is 12mm. It's a good idea to put a bungee cord or something around the steering wheel when the column's disconnected. Checking out the new to us engine. Pulled off the damaged intake manifold. It's typical for the intake ports to be gummed up some because it's direct injection. You can see because it's a junkyard motor, the lines and wires have just been cut off, so you have to remove all that stuff. So at this point, we set a pallet under the engine, lowered the car down with the engine setting on it, unbolted the engine and the transmission mount, and lifted the car up off of it. So I started pulling things off the old engine, pulled the heat shield off and the exhaust manifold off. I think this is where the oil was coming from. It's kind of hard to tell. When I removed the manifold, some oil came out. Pulled the transfer case off. I ended up swapping over the fuel pump and the vacuum pump as well. Got most of the wiring harness and cooling rat's nest disconnected here. This is the drive belt tensioner. Get to the bolts when you can. So you have to remove the alternator before fully removing the engine. Keep an eye on a good time to pull that really long bolt out. So there's a little plastic cover that you pull off next to where the starter was. Then you can pull off the flex plate nuts. Started taking out the bell housing bolts in order to remove the transmission. We put the hoist on it in order to be able to move the engine transmission around a little bit to maneuver the trans off while it's on the pallet. For some reason, you'll notice there is no shim behind the flex plate on the new engine here. So if your old engine has one and the new doesn't, make sure you swap that over. So here's the old engine. You can see the shim behind the flex plate. So I ended up swapping the flex plate over as well, just to be safe, to make sure it meshed up with the trans and the starter. This is a good time to check for leaks on the transmission and on the engine. When you torque down the flex plate bolts, you're going to have to put a breaker bar on the crankshaft pulley on the other end of the motor. Started putting the evap lines and such on the top of the motor. Put the transfer case back on. Put the exhaust manifold and the heat shield on. This is a good time to check your pulleys. Swapped the intake manifold over from the old motor because it was in better shape. Got the cut-up wiring harness off the junkyard motor and put the car's wiring harness onto the junkyard motor. And this was the hardest part of the whole job. Lining up the pallet well enough that the car could be lowered over it and that the studs for the mounts on the engine and transmission would line up, and that the alternator would clear the hanging AC compressor. So basically the best way to line it up was to hit the pallet with a sledgehammer. Trying to coax it around with a pry bar didn't work very well. This is how I did it. I've never done one of these engines before, and we didn't have access to a lift table. So the subframe just has a torque mount for the engine, so the engine transmission can hang there just fine from the body of the car. So got the column bolted up again, put everything back in the engine bay, put all the fluids in it, took the spark plugs out and spun it over with the starter so that it would get oil pressure before running. Put the suspension back together. Bye.